Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, let's first clarify this. The Zimbabwean government is to compensate white commercial farmers not for the land, but for improvements to the land.
Sure. Yeah, so you will recall that when the Zimbabwean government became desperate on the land question, to resolve the land question, it sought to do it outside of the bounds of the law.
Yeah.
And progressively, the rule of law stopped determining how government would do things, and then it became a haphazard strategy where the elite, got land. There was no clear strategy in terms of who would benefit from the land.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was the issue of doing away with, willing buyer, willing seller, and ultimately with no compensation at all.
Yeah.
And all of this done outside of the bounds of the law. So the issue around paying only for compensation, you can sort of compare it to what we have in South Africa, where Section 25 of our Constitution will make provision for just and equitable compensation, which means that you don't necessarily gain market value, but that you would be paid for things like improvements, or where there's been state investments where you're not going to be paid for that. So,
but how does the government determine, the improvements that were made to this land when these farms have been run down?
Yeah.
When they took over most of those farms, they waited for the harvest just before harvesting, took the crops, took the plants in terms of the equipment, sold everything. How then do you determine?
Yeah.
The
Look, I think that's where you see the what happens when politics meet social issues and the law, because this is precisely the question: is that how do you have records to show what the value of the land was when the land was taken, and how are you going to evidence the type of improvements and what those improvement costs, and so it is going to be a very difficult. I mean, if you look at the amount, I think it's equivalent to about 200 million.
Yeah, it's $18 million,
which is very conservative on its own. So I think it's a political response to a very important social issue that has dogged the country for a while now.
Do you think that President Mnangagwa is looking at this and saying, listen, we need to look friendly to the West, is he now being nice to white farmers so that the West can look at Zimbabwe and say you're now making the right changes and so forth?
It's a very unenviable position that he finds himself. But I think that he's, you can't make cosmetic changes to a wound that has festered. What needs to be done is you need to have clarity on the rule of law. You need to strengthen institutions. You need to be clear about what it is that your plan is to get Zimbabwe on the map again. I think a statement, and I mean, even if you judge the amounts that have been set aside, they are, they point to a desperate move for a situation that the government hasn't had hold of for a long time.
Now, of course, there are hardliners within ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party in Zim, Mnangagwa's party, who do not agree with this in any way whatsoever. You've also got the EFF leader, Julius Malema, coming out and saying anyone who compensates for expropriation of land is a sellout, basically calling Mnangagwa a sellout. This comes to those social issues. This is people looking at it from a colonial perspective, isn't it? How do you marry those two?
Look, I think the issue of land and colonization, it's not something that only affects Zimbabwe and South Africa. What needs to be done is countries get to a point where they decide on the foundational values of how they want to restore justice for past injustices, but also to have solutions for the kind of country and future that they want. So if you're going to only focus on retribution, it's not something that's going to help solve future issues. But then I think it's an important statement to also make, to say that resolving the land question is necessarily involves delivery of justice to people who were were landless. So, but in doing that, your laws must align to that. Your institutions must align to that. The leaders, or the leaders that have to implement the laws, must also follow a process that is, where there's a law of general application. Yeah. And so, I think the problem lies in the haphazard manner that is unmonitored, where you actually can't even monitor where the land is actually going. Yeah. And we've seen, evidence of corruption and, people that are close to power that seem to benefit. So
it benefited a lot, especially within that Zimbabwe context. Not just bring it back home and just something personal for you, because you've written about this subject in an article in the Mail and Guardian last year, where you said the land issue, this is about anticipating the reversal of a deliberate, systematic and legislated eradication of a nation's sense of dignity, belonging, culture and history. It is a wound that has festered long enough. So you're pro
I'm pro-land reform. In fact, it's not even about my personal feelings. It's about what is a constitutional mandate. What was put in our constitution was that the state would take reasonable steps. In fact, the state would foster conditions to make sure that there's access to land on an equitable basis. Yep. And the state is also being told to protect the tenure and rights of those that are vulnerable from illegal evictions. The state has been told to restore land to those that can prove that land was taken away from them. Yep. So the issue of land reform is not a nice to have. It's a moral, it's not just also a legal obligation, it's also a moral obligation. Yep. So it's very important that it is done in a systematic, lawful, peaceful manner that, that actually makes everyone, every part of South Africans' society to really behind it.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. When we look at the Zimbabwe government wanting to compensate white commercial farmers for their land, and just to clarify, it's not for the land, it's for improvements made to the land. Thank you so much, Bulelwa, for coming through. Bulelwa Mabasa there from Werksman's attorneys, talking about the Zimbabwe situation and just land in general. It's a very important topic on the African continent, of course.